So the next type of market failure that is related to environmental issues is the market failure known as a public good. The public good is an economic phenomena that arises from the characteristics of a product. Externalities exist because the production or consumption of a product produces damage that accrues outside of the market itself. Now, there are positive externalities as well, goods for which consumption actually creates benefit for those outside of the market. A good example of this is a flu shot. If I get a flu shot, it reduces the potential that everyone that I come in contact with will get the flu shot. And so regardless of whether other people get flu shots, if I get my flu shot, this creates benefit to everyone else. The thing about positive externalities is that ultimately they end up mostly feeling like public goods. And I think that'll make a little bit more sense here in just a moment. Goods can be organized by two characteristics, rival and excludable. The term rival refers to the fact that as I consume a unit of a product, the overall stock of the product is reduced. In other words, I go into a store and I buy a laptop computer, there's one less laptop computer now. The firm will have to produce an additional laptop to make up for the one that I just purchased. So it's rival, it draws down the stock of the product. If a product is excludable, this simply means that its consumption can be prevented, most often with a price. So goods that have prices are excludable because there's always going to be someone who either is unwilling to pay for the product or is unable to pay for the product. And so the consumption is excludable. There is a particular class of public goods called the pure public good, which are both non-rival and non-excludable. That is, that the consumption of their benefits does not reduce the overall stock of benefits, nor does the consumption of their benefits, can they be prevented. I think with public goods, it's a good time for us to have a conversation about what we mean by consumption and what we mean by benefits. As an economist, my belief system largely revolves around the concept of mutual benefits. That means that individuals, entities engage in economic transactions to satisfy some mutual benefit, profits, utility, whatever the case may be. When we think about environmental issues, or really any issue, but particularly environmental issues, I think it's important for us to think about these from the context of benefits, in the sense that benefits are experienced, not necessarily just because one consumes something. This will actually be a point of contention that we cover here in just a few moments when we talk about the idea of non-market value. But the overall idea is that when I experience the benefit of something, like for example national defense and the safety that arises from that, this is a benefit that when I enjoy the benefit of national defense, it doesn't reduce anybody else's ability of enjoying national defense. So it's non-rival. And also, if I'm within a country that has strong national defense, you can't really exclude anyone from enjoying the benefits of that. So again, it's non-excludable. Clean air is another good example of this, where the benefits of clean air aren't necessarily kind of objectively consumed. I mean, we were certainly consuming clean air, but no one kind of walks outside and goes, I need to consume a certain amount of clean air before I go do something else. The benefits of clean air kind of arrive to us almost without thinking, just in the same way that the national defense does. Of course, we need mechanisms that provide those things. Clean air, for example, in an era of immense pollution. National defense, if we're, say, in an era of extreme, strife and conflict. Another form of pure public good would be human capital. This is the social benefit, essentially, of people becoming more educated. As people become more educated, all sorts of good things starts to occur. You have lower crime rates. You have increases in wealth. You have increases in voter power. All sorts of good things occur when a country experiences human capital. And if you live in a country that experiences increases in human capital, then again, it's hard to kind of get people, sort of prevent people from enjoying those in a sort of literal sense. Now, certainly there can be structural economic things that are going on in an economy that prevents someone from experiencing a particular benefit, but sort of putting those things aside, generally speaking, it's hard to prevent someone from enjoying increases in education rates, for example. The issues with public good here is that the market doesn't know how to handle this at all. The market really requires scarcity. That is to say that there has to be some idea that this product is in limited supply. Otherwise, there's no there's no profit to be made from it. No one sort of wants to produce it if it's non-scarce, and that's where the non-rivalry comes from. But then also, if you can't prevent someone from consuming a good, then there's no way you can make profit in it. And so again, then that sort of negates the sort of excludable nature of it. And we don't expect markets to be able to handle pure public goods at all, mainly because there is no way for the market to rely upon its foundational functions. And what I mean by that is profit maximization and utility maximization. Certainly, I gain utility by consuming clean air, but I exist in a world in which paying for clean air would be considered almost crazy. Excuse me. Now, eventually, we may get to a point where paying for clean air is something that we have to do, but for the time being, we still have a large enough stock of clean air that, it's a non-rival and non-excludable good. And so these are pure public goods would also be market failures. Because we just don't think the market will really know how to handle it. Mostly our expectation is that for pure public goods, the market will way under-provide the product. If we only relied upon private national defense, we probably would not have enough or the right type of national defense. The same with clean air and human capital. If we left these things up to the private market, the issue basically is that there would be more profits to be made by actually reducing these things than there would be profits to be made by increasing them. And so clearly that would negate kind of a functioning market. Pure private goods are goods that are rival and excludable. These are most goods. These are goods that, computers and laptops and jackets and tables and desks and so on and so forth. These are the goods that we buy on an everyday basis. They're rival, they're excludable, and markets know how to handle them. Markets know how to deal with them. Markets know how to function with pure private goods because they're able to take advantage. And then we have club goods. Club goods are interesting. Club goods are non-rival but excludable. A good example of a club good would be satellite radio, where my consumption of satellite radio is excludable in that it has a price that I have to pay in order to experience the subscription service. But when I get a subscription service to satellite radio, it doesn't reduce the stock of available subscription services. A gym membership is another good example where, again, I get a membership at a gym. Now, when I'm at the gym, I may physically reduce the amount of space available to other people at the gym, but the idea behind a gym is not everybody goes at the same time. And so, effectively, a gym membership is non-rival, but clearly a gym membership would be excludable. These types of markets, non-rival and excludable, are actually handled well by markets. It actually turns out that it isn't so much the scarcity that is so important to markets, it's just the ability to prevent someone from consuming without paying, which, when you think about it, actually makes a lot of sense. And so what we find is that the main thing that makes a market work in the context of rivalness or excludability is excludability. If we lack excludability, this causes major problems in markets, whether it's a pure public good or the good that we're going to discuss right now. And that's the commons good. So the commons good, these are goods which are rival but non-excludable, meaning that the consumption of them reduces their available stock, but you can't prevent someone from reducing the available stock. They're non-excludable. This leads to what we refer to as the tragedy of the commons, which was first written about by Garrett Hardin in 1968, and then really, I think, well spelled out in a Dietz et al. Paper from 2003, which you'll actually be reading this week. For class. The tragedy of the commons refers to a set of goods known as commons goods, or otherwise known as common resource goods. Common resource goods are goods like fisheries, grazing areas, in which the use of these areas is impossible to prevent. A fishery, for example, is extremely cheap to use. You don't even need an expensive boat to catch fish out of a particular fishery. You just need to be able to get to the shore with a fishing pole. And so fishing in a fishery is largely non-excludable, but every time you catch a fish, it's rival. It reduces the available stock of fish, and depending upon the spawn rate of fish, you may catch fish in a completely unsustainable way. In fact, tragedy of the commons is really one of the first sort of economically related issues of sustainability since Thomas Malthus talked about on the principle of population, which of course you read from last week. Both of those issues, the Malthusian catastrophe as well as a tragedy of the commons, arises from an inability of humans to see into the future that their current behavior is unsustainable. Malthus argued in Principle of Population that the ability to grow food would be outstripped by the population growth, and despite the fact that this never occurred in developed economies, we actually see that in many developing economies with high population growth rates, it does seem to negatively impact their economy. We also see that in countries that have really high population growth rates that don't have developed economic systems, they actually throughout history have experienced things like famines, for example. So while we may look at the Industrial Revolution as something that Malthus didn't see when he stated that population growth was going to result in a catastrophe, we actually see that if in developing countries population growth actually is very problematic. This is related very similarly to the tragedy of the commons, in which people behave in such a way, again, in their self-interest, without realizing that their behavior is in fact causing, a large-scale problem. Fisheries are especially prone to this particular issue, and over the last 40 to 50 years, fishery collapse has been a really big global problem. We've actually had fishery collapse for several types of fish, including the North Atlantic sturgeon. There is a fishery collapse concern with tuna. Due to the increased popularity in sushi, for example. There have been issues in the United States with fishery collapse in salmon, and many other types of fish also tend to be caught in unsustainable ways, such that the catching of those fish outstrips the ability of the fish to repopulate themselves. And this leads to a tragedy of the commons. One of the things that is particularly unfortunate about the tragedy of the commons is, in fact, that as the problem starts to become worse, the economic incentives further push it towards tragedy. There's a really interesting example of this in the book The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert, which came out, I believe, 4 or 5 years ago. She talks about what we call the first penguin, which was the auk, the A-U-K, the auk. And the auk is a species of bird, it's a flightless bird, and it only really existed on this small, hard-to-reach island up near Scandinavian countries. And because this island was hard to get to, there was excludability, the auk was relatively safe. Over time, however, boats became more technologically innovative, and so boaters could now get to the island. The auk is kind of a fat bird. It's slow-moving. It's very oily. It produces both food and oil for lighting and for various reasons. And then one other particular characteristic about the auk that really spelled its doom is it lays 1 egg a year. A female auk lays 1 egg a year, and so as a result, this puts the Auk at sort of a relatively precarious position. So what ends up happening is that the boats are now able to get to the island. The boaters simply get off onto the island. They then scare the birds onto the boat while someone waits to thrash them about the head with a club, and the Auk dies. So this starts. So the Auk starts to die. It starts to become a resource that people are now turning into an economic resource. So people are buying Auk oil. People are buying Auk meat. So it actually becomes a resource itself. And now it's no longer non-excludable. It's no longer excludable. It's now non-excludable because people can get to the island. And then, again, this is what I meant by sort of a relatively perverse thing occurs, where as the Auk becomes more scarce, the price of an Auk rises. And as the price of an Auk rises, the incentive to catch an Auk and sell it rises as well. So now, as the Auk is growing more scarce, the economic incentives to catch an Auk increases. And this is, obviously extremely problematic. And so, spoiler alert, the Auk is hunted into extinction, and it's almost a perfect example of a tragedy of the commons, in which, if the Auk is able to be hunted in a sustainable way, it could provide oil and food for generations potentially. But because the Auk doesn't lay many eggs, because the Auk is slow, it has no sort of evasiveness to it, it can very easily be caught, then there's very little friction preventing its being caught. And so, again, the sort of forces of the economic system, alongside the sort of forces of nature, kind of had it in for the Auk. And so it ends up being a relatively sad story, but I think a very instructive one regarding kind of, tragedy of the commons. There have been several other tragedy of the commons throughout history. One example where we actually saw success and was able to bring an animal back was the American bison. So during Manifest Destiny, as people were moving out west and conquering animals and other humans alike, they are hunting the American bison at first just as sort of a resource for meat and for clothes. But then over time, the bison becomes popular back east, and specifically its skull. And so people now hunt bison simply for their skulls and to be sent back. Because the bison was just sort of free roaming, it was a non-excludable good, but it was, again, rival because the birth rates of bison are very low. And so humans hunt bison nearly into extinction, and it wasn't until government regulation, which prevented the killing of bison, actually stemmed the tide. And nowadays we actually have, once again, have a healthy American bison population. The lesson here is that, if the good is a private good or a club good, the market generally knows how to handle it. But if the good is commons or a public good, then because the good is non-excludable, then a market doesn't really know how to either market the product or sort of commodify it, or it doesn't know how to prevent the overexploitation, say in the context of tragedy of the commons. And so this is very problematic, and from a resource perspective, this is very troubling. And so when we talk about negative externalities, we're sort of more talking about environmental degradation. When we talk about public goods, we're talking more about problems related to resources. And so throughout the course, we're going to kind of straddle these lines between environmental issues that are about degradation, things like pollution, air, water pollution, but also issues related to resources, oil, natural gas, and things like that, and even resources like fish and food and forests and all these various things, because they potentially suffer a public goods problem. And if they suffer a public goods problem, then we that was across the street there doing construction. Then we can then we have an idea of why there may be a market failure there, and we may have the potential to sort of be able to solve it. There are various ways to reduce tragedy of the commons. One way, for example, with fisheries, is they created catch shares, where in order to catch fish, you have to actually buy into the system. It's kind of similar to sort of internalizing an externality, but the idea is that you only give out so many permits to fish. So there's a limited number of permits. Essentially what you're doing is you're making fishing excludable. By only giving a certain number of permits and by making individuals have to pay for those permits in order to fish, you're making fishing excludable, and that helps the market become more sustainable. So, the thing again is that we can kind of look at market failures as existing because of markets, or we can look at market failures as existing because of the characteristics of certain goods. The goods that produce negative externalities, but also those goods that would be non-excludable, like pure public goods or commons goods. All right, so here's something I actually want you to sort of try out.